Today we talk about the true villain. Turns out it was the French all along, and that joke was specifically here to activate the almonds of that one guy who launched into a dissertation when I made a joke about like the flag on the moon being white and was bleached by the sun. Guess he couldn't handle the Roanoke style. So I think we all know life can be a bit of a clown from time to time, and as a result, sometimes it likes to put malformed blood vessels into your brain that could become a massive aneurysm just as a prank bro. Well, because of this affliction the bro known as Derek has, which is kind of hilarious because in this movie the actors' names are actually literally the names in the movie, he and his documentary buddy Cliff go on a trip to hit all the high points around the world. From Paris to the Great Wall of China, he wants to document his travels before the blood vessel in his brain erupts, cutting the game short. However, he doesn't make it very far before meeting up with a woman who thinks she's being kind, but really she's just dooming anyone that she infects. Anyhow, this infection at first seems pretty great, but gets worse as time goes along. You know, like most infections. So in today's episode, let's discuss the affliction in Afflicted, and not The Afflicted, because that is just a complete rip. But first, this episode is sponsored by Audible. Not only can you listen to hundreds of audiobooks across multiple genres, but you can now also immerse yourself in Middle-earth. Between August 15th and October 13th, Alexa customers can listen to The Lord of the Rings free on Alexa through October 13th for 60 days. Just say, Alexa, read The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. See? Watch. Alexa, read Fellowship of the Ring.
This month, stream The Fellowship of the Ring, the first part of J.R.R. Tolkien's epic adventure The Lord of the Rings. Free on Alexa through October 13th.
This is Audible.
So if all that sounds good to you, because I mean, who doesn't want to listen to a free audiobook, then by using Audible as your go-to for The Lord of the Rings Book 1, you can listen to it at no cost on Alexa through October 13th today. So why not try Audible today, where you also get 1 free credit per month, every month, for an audiobook in the premium selection. Sounds like a pretty good deal. So heading the link in my description, or just simply asking your Alexa to read The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, you can start listening today. All right, let's get back to it. So we kick off our story with basically the opening from Cloverfield, except these guys left a day early so the party isn't ruined by a giant family-eating monster. They're heading to 6 different continents to look at a bunch of cool stuff, and due to Derek's potential for a brain aneurysm as discussed, which Cliff will be joining him. His longtime friend ever since they were kids. Also, Cliff knows what's up, planes are horrible things. He also apparently is worried about the Ebola virus, pretty obscure thing to be worried about when you're getting on a tube that flies through the air that's also heading towards France first. If you know, you know. The plan is this: film everything and post it online. They appear to have their own website where people can actually comment and post stuff about them doing crazy things like eating scorpions or doing some cliff diving or talking to an infected woman at the bar where, you know, she could snap your spine like a small twig. You know, all the fun things in life. Anyhow, with all that said, some people disagree with the decision. Pretty much all of Derek's family. They're concerned about his condition and as a result, do not want him to go, as if he collapses overseas, it's gonna be really hard for the family to get to him in time, and as a result, they really don't know if this choice to leave is actually them seeing him for the last time, which could actually probably be a pretty sound assumption, to be honest. So they land in Barcelona, and the trip is off to a pretty good start. You know, all the standard stuff. Nerd with a camera, filming another nerd with a camera. And I can't help but ask, where did they actually get all the money to do this trip exactly? And how, as a relatively young man, did they both leave their job for like a year? Anyhow, they're meeting up with their 2 friends who were in a band called Unalaska for the evening to see their show. How did these guys get a Europe tour? I don't know. It sounds a little too anemic for me, but hey, maybe it's Europe. I don't know. So the 2 days they spend there is nothing but partying, skydiving, and Derek hitting on random women and getting brushed off. Then things take a turn. They head to France. It's now day 7. Derek has been swinging out the entire week, so his friends are trying to gas him up. Derek stands in the back and sort of just orbits women, which is never a good look. Cliff tells Derek that he needs to lead with, I have a brain aneurysm and I could just drop at any point, which ends up attracting the attention of one woman in the back. Everything's coming up Derek. The group is then invited back to a party after the show, but prior to that, they decide to head back to the hotel and CB Derek. What is CB? Well, it's when your friends bust into a room when you're just trying to have fun. Because honestly, I mean, what's the point of having friends if you don't do that? So as they get there, they do burst in, and it turns out the woman was a little bit aggressive, which, believe it or not, is really not as fun as it sounds. But they find him on the bed bleeding with his eyebrow cracked open and a bite on his arm. At this point, they debate on if they should go to the hospital or not because they don't know if it was brought on by the aneurysm, but Derek wakes up and says he has no memory of what happened. So okay, I want you to remember this part right here. Derek is pretty much beaten up. We'll make what's said later completely hilarious. So all of the woman's girlfriend's clothes and all of her stuff are still just laid out on the bed, which means she's running around in the nude. The next day, Cliff and Derek continue their trek across Europe, with Derek being an extra sleepy man, sleeping on the train, wincing at the light, and finally making it to Italy, where Derek then crashes out for the evening, attempting to sleep the entire next day. Cliff finally had enough of this and wakes him up to the harsh light of day. Also, after only 2 days, Derek's wounds are healing like suspiciously fast. They head back out to the patio and go get some food as he's starving. As he launches into it, it's not going to go down that easy, and he ends up puking it everywhere and freaking everyone out. That night, Derek says he's feeling better, but Cliff suggests that they need to go to the hospital. Derek says that he doesn't want to because if he goes and they find something, he might get stuck there, so it's an instant decline. So it's now day 11. Derek is having difficulty dealing with the light in his eyes as they go get a tour of the local vineyard. As they begin walking through outside, Derek is dealing with some integument system pain as his skin starts literally burning off of his body. The vineyard owner points out to the inside of the house and says just run there as Derek's skin continues to burn. They give him water, but his skin has become quite blistered. Cliff later does a confession moment on camera talking about Derek. He has to convince Derek that it's time to go home as clearly something isn't right. Derek gets upset by the news and goes goblin mode on the wall, punching a hole through it. At first, they believe maybe the wall was just cheap plaster, but in reality, it was made of rocks. Derek has super strength at this point and can literally just break things with his hands. This prompts him to go outside and try another larger rock to confirm that he has become the Giga Chad, which he has. The tests continue at this point, showing that not only does he have super strength, but he also has super speed. At first, they're both pretty stoked over it as they walk back home, but then Derek begins having some issues. Grabbing his eye, he literally removes the outer layer of his cornea and what appears to be his iris. This results in an eye changing for a moment as the transformations continue. Essentially, his pupil can now enlarge massively, helping him see at night. Later on, Derek attempts to eat regular food to find out what he can actually eat and what he can't, but he continues throwing up. Derek's brother now calls Cliff to yell at him and basically tell him that he needs to get Derek to come home. As Cliff goes to talk to Derek, he's just kind of Spider-Manning in the corner to scare him, but Derek says that he feels fine and begins jumping around also like Spider-Man in public, heading up onto rooftops and climbing buildings. As Derek goes to jump from one building to prove that he's not sick, because that's going to prove it, he ends up failing and then falling, which proves virtually nothing really. I mean, he just needs to go to the hospital. Walking across the road, I don't get this part. They almost get hit by a car, and then randomly the Italian guys get out and just start attacking them. I'm not really sure why. They were in the middle of the road for a while walking across. This car had plenty of time to stop, but then Derek just yeets one dude hardcore against the car, which bloodies him up. But unbeknownst to Cliff, in the footage that he uploaded, Derek begins licking blood off his hand in the background, which is fairly tasty. So as you might imagine, that's a bit alarming to, probably anyone involved. So Cliff does decide to confront Derek, asking him if he licked the blood off his hand, which Derek appears to acquiesce over. Now he continues to cover up his window with newspaper to block out the light. Cliff suggests that this is literal vampirism, which is actually pretty cool to see someone literally call out what it looks like. But Derek does the skeptic thing and scoffs, but then understands, you know what, actually maybe you're right, I probably need blood. And he needs blood really badly. Cliff goes and gets Derek cow blood and then documents it. Unfortunately, it doesn't go well as Derek starts to begin regurgitating it because it's not what he actually needs. He says it smelled awful, so maybe it needs to be fresh. So he hatches a plan. Go get some sausage, go out and find a stray dog or cat, and then feed. However, all the animals around are people's pets, so basically family. Cliff talks him out of it, but then they remember the pig from the vineyard. Derek goes to get the piglet, and I think he kind of just tears off its head, starts drinking his blood, which appears to not work as he throws up that blood too. Derek surmises that it has to be human blood, which that's always kind of a monkey wrench in the plan. So they decide that they need to go to a blood bank to get some blood, which Derek just totally botches it by showing his ID for some reason, and then having to run out of the blood bank because it's not looking good. Derek then goes GTA on an ambulance as there's some guys back there flatlining. Paramedic is yelling at them in Italian, which they can't understand her, but Derek sees the blood and begins going goblin mode before stopping and both running out from the ambulance. Derek then tells Cliff that if things get any worse that he needs to leave. Spoiler, he won't. Good friend, bad judgment call. Later that night, Cliff is woken up by Derek in his room as he immediately begins seizing on the ground. Derek at this point ain't looking so hot. His body is continuing to seize, but he can smell Cliff's blood and reacts to it. Cliff makes the rookie mistake of being like, oh, I'm not worried about it. Derek's still in there. Derek won't hurt me. Derek will hurt you. Despite Derek going full vampire, this didn't say to him to just get out of there. So on night 17, Cliff decides to actually help him. Cuts open his arm, collecting some of the blood, and goes to feed Derek. Running through the streets, they appear to end up back at the vineyard where Cliff actually tracked him to an abandoned area. With these tracking skills, he'd actually make a great vampire hunter. However, he doesn't have the common sense. Entering the cellar area, from what it looks like, he spots Derek in the corner. He goes to give Derek the blood, but Derek doesn't want just a vial of blood, so he attacks Cliff and then cracks his skull, which maybe also snaps his neck. But this ends him in the process as Derek drinks his blood. And you would think that this would end here, right? Nope. All right, so this part absolutely without a doubt has to be blurred because Susan will be all over me like ugly on an ape if I don't. Derek sits in front of the camera, apologizes for taking out Cliff, and introduces his brains to some fresh air. Talk about free your mind and the rest will follow. But you can't see it, so let me describe it. Basically, his fractured skull pieces begin going back into place as Derek then wakes back up, seemingly saved by his vampirism. On night 21, Derek talks on camera more about Cliff and shows the back of his head where the wound is. Derek now becomes desperate for a cure, so he elects to find Audrey. So he uploads his rant and decides on day 22 to head back to France. He's going to honor Cliff's memory by keeping the cameras rolling. Derek now needs to know if he can go outside at all. So he opens a window and tests it, and with his skin burning in about half a second, no he cannot. But he hatches a plan. Just go at night. But unfortunately, it's ruined by Interpol showing up. They caught him on camera at the hospital, which leads to Derek attacking the cops. As he takes off, apparently Interpol doesn't play around as they just kind of open up on him, popping him multiple times, which I imagine is quite painful, but it does not end him. Eventually, he's able to lose them, however, considering how fast he is, and hides in a cave to get out of the sun. It is now night 22 as he heads out east of Nice. His skin is looking good from his romp in the sun, and he mentions how he left everything behind, so now the cops have everything they need to basically track him. He eventually is able to jump on a train and heads to an underground area in France. People are all over his webpage commenting on his videos telling him that the cops are looking for him and he needs to come home. That sounds like quitter talk, because really he's got a blood vendetta to rectify. Searching through Cliff's footage later to find any clues on how to find Audrey, he comes across one clip where Audrey's clothes, including her phone, are there. He realizes that her phone must actually be back at the hotel, and that's his ticket to actually finding her. So it is now night 25 as Derek heads to the hotel to like a very skeptical front deskman. As Derek looks through the lost and found, he finds the phone, but then runs into his brother on the way out. The cops were already there, and his brother tries to talk him off the ledge as then Derek takes off. The cops now surround him as he just leaps onto a building Morbius style, and there's for some reason already a cop up on the roof who then gets knocked off. Derek then tries to go to help him, but he falls to his doom. I'm not sure why he couldn't pull him up, but Derek is also looking rough. Meanwhile, back in the Batcave, Derek shows that he has the phone. He messages everyone in that phone to come and find Audrey, which basically come and find him. But it doesn't go very well as nobody responds to Derek, and he continues having issues with the lack of blood. But finally, someone does call. It is now night 27. He stalks the area as a man shows up calling for Audrey. Derek stalks him back on his route home. I guess it's his home, just really it's a giant abandoned building. But going into his room, Derek is then attacked by the man, but he gets overcome by Derek. So here's the thing. This guy is supposedly not a good dude, but he's got a bone saw with him, and it's already covered in blood. Derek thinks that it must be one of her friends, but really doesn't understand the situation of why he would have Audrey's number in the first place. He says that we will wait there until she shows up, or he can't hold out any longer and needs blood. Derek questions Maurice, by the way his name's Maurice, on where Audrey is, but it turns out he's got bite marks all over him as well. Derek isn't the first one Audrey has turned, but he tells him to run, which is a little bizarre. Not really sure why. Something happens here, but how would he know? Anyways, Maurice goes on to tell Derek that he's ungrateful for this gift that he's gotten. I don't know. Maurice is losing it, I guess, or he's just simping really, really hard. But that doesn't matter as the whole place is in flashbanged as the French SWAT breaks in. The confrontation is quick, with Derek taking a ton of rounds, but he's a vampire, so it doesn't do much. It knocks him out momentarily, probably hitting his spine, but after a few moments, he gets back up and continues morbing on everyone imaginable. He begins stalking the rest of the SWAT team members, taking them out one by one and drinking their blood. Delicious! Heading back to his underground lair, Derek then washes off the blood, and I don't really get why Maurice was scared earlier if he's a vamp too, but hey, maybe he's just a giant baby. As Derek sits there, he gets a call on the phone with Audrey to meet up. He hides his camera and then waits for her. Eventually, she does arrive, which results in a right proper domestic between the two. Audrey tells him that he's not feeding enough, and then she goes in this exposition about how his body will not let him starve. He asks the standard thing about, well, why won't you just cure me then? Which, don't you think she would have done that if she could? Basically, she breaks it down to this. You're screwed, you have to eat, there's no way out, Godspeed. But she does leave him with some parting advice. Just because he has to eat every 4 to 5 days doesn't mean it has to just be like orphans and single fathers working 9 to 5 to support their families. You can pick and choose who you really want to eat. Derek asks why she infected him in the first place, if this is actually a curse, and she said, oh, I thought I was being kind because you were dying. Now I see that was a mistake. Like, yeah, no, duh, sweetheart. Like, okay, this part's dumb. First, she knows how craptacular the infection is. She literally just said that she has been trying to end herself, and that is preferable, but she can't actually die. On top of that, being kind, you literally just punched this man in the head to unconsciousness and then bit him. Which part of that's kind? Nah, bro. Total cop-out. 0 out of 10 logic right there. You're really just being a giant douche canoe who saw easy prey. Boo this woman. But now Derek realizes, hey, you know what? but it isn't all that bad, because at night 37, he then drops off a video to his family on the page saying it's been about 12 days. He does all the standard, I love you, I'm trying to find myself, I'm mega infected with vampirism, all of the stuff we sent our family in college. But you think these videos would have been picked up by the government, considering it literally confirms vampires, but Derek has elected to go after smallish adult predators. And I have to say it that way, because also I will get yeeted off this platform if I actually say what it is. So he finds anyone who's doing nefarious things and gives them the same chance that they gave their victims. So at the end of it, he is sort of like a superhero. Like, he's actually legitimately better than Morbius, because he has a testicular fortitude to go after real villains and not just sit there and, oh, my blood. Anyways, the affliction is an interesting disease as it continues to work its way through the human meat suit. We have seen several things about it, from enhanced strength to speeds really only achieved by Spartan 2s to abilities concerned with leaping that would likely tear away muscle from bone. So the question here becomes, what exactly is going on with the internal anatomy? Because as far as we can tell, the external physiology appears largely unchanged, which is fairly interesting given all of the broad mutations taking place underneath the skin. But prior to getting there, let's first discuss what is going on with the skin and eyes. Whenever Derek goes outside during the late stages of the infection, his skin goes from being able to handle it to literally being burned away. I believe what is taking place is likely an aggressive form of albinism. While Derek does still possess skin pigmentation, it appears as though the melanin associated with the pigmentation will not adequately protect the cell and nucleus, and as a result, this causes catastrophic damage to the cell, resulting in rapid apoptosis of that cell, causing it to leak out its contents into the surrounding area, resulting in the blisters that we see. This rapid destruction of cells indicates that while something is taking place within the cells, which we'll discuss later, the full protection of the cell is severely inhibited. Moving on to the eyes, what did we just watch? I would suggest what is actually happening here is the literal human iris is coming out of the eyes. Due to how large the pupils can actually get when we see Derek uncover his eye later, this is clearly an adaptation that allows him to hunt at night, since the sun totally destroys the skin. The new iris appears to have been forming underneath the human iris while the infection continued to progress. Once this happens, it would then push forward the other iris until finally it would begin scratching against the eyelid, alerting Derek that something was wrong. As he thought it was his contact lens, he pulled it out only to realize it was actually his leftover human piece of him. And this is the largest example that we see of an outward change to the morphology, but even then, the vampire iris has the ability to open and contract in terms of greater abilities than a normal iris would. So, to put it plainly, multiple systems in the body are affected by this infection. The skeletal structure after Derek's infection appears in some ways to have been altered, but in others, not so much, concerning the facial bones and appearance of the skull overall. This would indicate to me that likely only certain areas were reinforced at critical points in order to allow for the body to function at the heightened capacity that it does. Let's start with the areas that were likely not reinforced based on what we have seen in presentation. The skull in general would not have been reinforced from what we can tell. This is because the sensitive tissue that lies just behind the skull, any reinforcement would put pressure on the brain or change the way which the mandible operates, which would not be good for the afflicted. Other areas that we can assume using the same parameters are the spinal column, due to the sensitive nature of the spinal cord itself, along with how vertebrae are required to move, which enlarging them would inhibit this movement and crush nerves that run between the vertebra, as well as the discs that are used to cushion them. The CNS itself, or central nervous system, and any bone associated with it, appears to have largely been ignored, and because of this we can assume things like potentially the rib cage have largely been left unaltered as well. However, getting to the extremity bones is where we can begin seeing the actual changes take place. While not immediately apparent on the outside, these bones would have been strengthened and hardened to a large degree, likely becoming denser in the process to allow for things like breaking rocks with just your hand without completely shattering the bone would indicate this, or how he's able to jump from higher up without breaking the bones in his legs. Now, there is a caveat to all of this. It's not just about bones. You need shock absorption in these areas, and even still, there is something known as a falciform ligament that if you fall from high enough up and land on your feet, it will slice your liver in half, leading you to bleed out, which, as you might guess, probably isn't ideal. Anyhow, back to the bones. So how are bones improved? Well, believe it or not, humans somewhat have this ability already, depending on who you are. It's my favorite example, and it's known as double bone density. Some people just have thicker bones than others. And yes, bone thickness absolutely equates to strength of the bone. I had somebody try to argue a counter before. It was a real head scratcher. It went a little something like this: dinosaurs didn't have stronger bones because of how large they were. I know, I'm just as confused as you are. Like, look at Titanosaurus. You're telling me that thing with massive bones only had massive bones because it was for funsies and not like to support a giant amount of weight? Truly, sometimes there are visionaries in my comment section. Okay, so where was I? Oh yeah, this double bone density really has no drawbacks apart from making you heavier and maybe a little less buoyant. Most people do not even realize they have it, so potentially, if you've ever been in a situation where you probably should have broken a bone and did not, it is possible that you do have double double bone density. For what Derek has to pull off, however, he would need potentially over quadruple bone density. This would require bone to become much thicker than average, even well past anything that humans could do, to allow for him to hit like he can and land like he can. This would mean that osteoblasts could be released all over the extremities under the direction of the disease to begin strengthening the bone. The only drawback to all this would be that it would tank his calcium levels in his bloodstream to a massive degree, and this would affect other systems downstream. This may be the reason he's actually degrading and sleeping as much as he can. As the body begins changing, this induces a sort of tiredness as it then grows and changes. Upon feeding, his system restabilizes and continues the process. Basically, for lack of a better term, the requirements his body needs in order to effectively grow in this new direction requires him to feed, and if he doesn't, he's literally starving to death. But the bone isn't the only issue when pulling this off. You need muscles, tendons, ligaments, all of these to act as shock absorbers and pullers to throw bone around fast enough. And when it's operating that fast with this much backing with the bone, that can break rocks. So let's move on to the musculature system, or really the connective tissue system, which is not necessarily a system, but the vernacular works. Muscles, tendons, ligaments, and cartilage all play a crucial role in helping you not melt into a puddle on the floor and in general maintain your life. Muscles help us move and absorb massive amounts of energy from things like walking. In fact, over time, our bodies have developed ways in order to use this passive energy in order to conserve our own energy. If you compare chimps walking to humans, you'll see there are a lot of differences. In fact, chimps use way more energy when walking, as they are lacking something comparable in size that humans have under a lot more tension: the Achilles tendon. This tendon acts as a spring when a person walks, absorbing and releasing energy to help with the stride. Chimps, on the other hand, have their Achilles tendon much smaller, and because of that, less energy is absorbed by walking and thus is in turn released, meaning the body overall has to supply this energy to maintain walking, so it's less efficient than human walking. Cartilage also serves as a fantastic shock absorber when coming down onto the ground in terms of anything between bone on bone action. This slimy substance that covers the edges of bones has a pretty good life expectancies, but as ours lengthens, we are learning the limitations of it more readily. However, back when we only lived to be like 30, this would help hunters run more fluidly with drastically less friction in our legs, helping to also conserve energy and pad the bones themselves. We can go ahead and assume, considering all the rest of the healing abilities of Derek, that the cartilage that he has will continue to also self-repair at any other rate that we have seen. The tendons and ligaments serve to keep everything together while the body operates. Tendons serve the crucial role of attaching muscle to bone, with the connection points being a structural weak point, which allows in extreme situations for muscle to actually tear away from bone by pulling the tendon so hard that it detaches from the bone. Sounds a little strange, but there's actually a story of a man who had a 1,200-pound boulder, or 544-kilo boulder, fall onto his chest that then was pushing him down a cliff to his doom. But due to the release of adrenaline, he was able to lift it off and continue the momentum of the rock, saving his life. It did, however, completely tear his pectoral muscle from his shoulder due to how hard the muscle had to pull, which detached the tendon from bone, which is pretty metal. Ligaments, on the other hand, keep bone connected to bone. Pretty crucial if you want to stay the shape that you are. Tendons and ligaments are known to absorb a lot of energy in themselves and release it in the next movement, taking the pressure off the muscle to contract for every single movement. Because of this, like the muscle, they too store the shock of energy and then disperse it. Now, all this sounds well and good, but the issue is taking a look at Derek and what he is capable of. Clearly, the connection points would need to be enhanced. However, lucky for him, the bone at this point was increasing in density. So I would suggest this: as Derek continues to grow, along with it, the muscle density, tendon density, and ligament density as well. Due to what tendons and ligaments are connected to, this meant that connection points were more readily integrated into bone as the bone grew into the tendon and vice versa, creating a much stronger melding between the two, which would be incredibly apropos considering the muscle behaves in a way that would indicate more intense contractility. And because of this, let's get into what the muscles would need to do to achieve such strength. With this idea summed up, with all the connections bones and muscles strengthened, let's talk about the contractility itself, as this was the only way for him to achieve what he can do. The first thing to understand about our bodies is we only access a fraction of our strength, and if you watch this channel a lot, you probably already know that. But this is by design, that we only access roughly 30% of overall strength, and at max 60% with focused training. Because if we accessed 100% of our strength at all times, we would not only break things around us all the time, we could kiss our fine motor movements goodbye, as well as any resemblance of life, because we would just be constantly injured. Just like the man throwing the 1,200-pound rock, muscle would tear away from bone all the time. Because we have that ability, our brain just won't let us use it, which is what we sort of see happening with Derek. Early into his starvation period, he is actually weaker. And this is because while the connections between muscle and bone have been strengthened, and with it likely the joints in his body, the brain is still largely in control of what's happening. And because of that, it is using human parameters still, despite his body being overhauled to the point that he's superhuman. As time goes on, however, he becomes more and more hungry, which presents an even more human response, believe it or not. Much like vampires, when humans become hungry, at first it may just present as a little bit of agitation, but as time goes on, aggression levels rise with it, and then, with that, strength. It's because your body knows that you're entering a period where energy levels are soon going to dwindle, and you should really start focusing on finding food. Because of this, portions of the brain will become less and less influential on maintaining the status quo. In some ways, the brain in some areas is enhanced in times like this, whereas in other areas it decreases in activity. For instance, the hypothalamus during times of starvation will have certain areas of it decrease in activity, allowing for you to resort to cannibalism if you become hungry enough. In other areas, such as the frontal cortex associated with planning, will increase in activity, allowing for you to, again, plan things out and find food. However, what I want you to focus on is aggression level rising the hungrier a human gets, or really, I guess, any animal for that matter. Survival is something most of us are highly interested in for as long as possible, and aggression, despite seeming like an outdated thing in our current society, really it's highly useful and actually runs all throughout human interaction. Anyhow, as aggression rises, this allows for the body to access more and more strength, and with it, the potential for damage, but the potential to eat. Now, normally in first world countries, most people typically aren't entering a life and death starvation issue. I say most, but our bodies will still begin the standard procedure should we go long enough without sustenance. With Derek, we see this tracking in a much more pronounced way, but still a very similar pathway. Whereas in us, when our strength rises by a few percentages, in Derek, it does the same, but with alterations to his meat suit to become stronger than anything we have, those few percentages of rising allow for him to access orders of magnitudes greater strength. This is why as time goes on, it goes from punching a wall and breaking it to a large rock to being able to leap up buildings. The more time that passes, the deeper he sinks into more animalistic behaviors until finally he has gone so far with his brain literally seizing from overactivity in some areas and decreased response in others that he's running off pure instinct, resulting in him punching his friend in the face, fracturing the skull, and snapping his neck. Once gaining nutrition again, his body will exit starvation mode and his brain will resume normal communication, and with it likely has his overall strength decrease alongside his aggression. However, much like going 4 or 5 days without eating yourself, it would begin to rise once again, leading to an enhanced strength due to the brain putting less safety parameters on muscle exertion and contractility in order for the body to survive. The last point to the meat suit before moving on to the actual infection is just how the body is able to do what it does, because there is something running throughout, and without it, Derek would likely still drop from exertion like anybody else was due to the strain that he's putting on his body, and this would be his healing factor. Now again, I can't show you, but clearly Derek has introduced his brain to some lead. His chest was riddled with lead when the French SWAT showed up or Interpol was trying to run him down. And even when he steps out into the sun and has his skin peel away, which he then heals a few hours later, all this indicates that the mitotic pathways of cells have been increased, but are still controlled, as he hasn't become one giant cancerous blob. Most mitosis works exactly the way it was intended to. Old cells are replaced. If there's an injury of some kind, a signal is sent out between cells closest to the injury to have the immune system show up, clear away the invaders as mitosis begins to close the wound and heal it. The process, depending on the amount of damage there is, can take a few days or months to complete, at least with humans. With Derek, however, the process has been overhauled. The microfractures that form in his bones from landing from a high up or punching a wall or a rock would be healed inside of a day instead of weeks. Skin damage appears to completely rectify itself after 2 days, depending on if it's a burn from the sun, which goes deeper, or if it's just a lead wound. The same can be said for the internal organs underneath as well. Even something as detrimental as the destruction of the brain is still healed. This would mean that another crucial component of the healing process isn't just dividing, but also the accessing of instructions that were originally there. This is why you form scar tissue when you get a cut on your skin rather than regular skin covering it back up. Or if you lose a finger, a new finger doesn't grow. There has to be access of instructions of what was originally there. So taking something as important as the brain, at least according to the brain's important. Thanks, brain. When something like this is damaged in a way, this would be absolutely detrimental to the longevity of a person and their personhood. In fact, 6 minutes without air can lead to a person being a vegetable for the rest of their life. The lights are on, but nobody's home sort of deal. It's really tragic stuff, but it highlights how fragile the brain actually is. Clearly, Derek destroyed his. This would indicate to me that not only is the healing factor dividing cells such as neurons, which typically do not divide, but also reconnecting the neurons to the original neurons, allowing for complete functionality to be returned. Now, this does raise a question after the fact: is Derek still the same Derek, or is his brain just operational and he's moving on? Well, I would argue that it has to be the same structure after after the damage is done due to the fact that he still remembers his parents, remembers Cliff, and he remembers Audrey. All this would require similar neural patterns to be maintained in order to fire memories correctly and allow for him to move around in the environment with purpose. Sort of like, you remember that one Wolverine movie? The name escapes me, but Wolverine takes an adamantium round to the brain. The brain heals, but was wiped clean because the round was able to pierce the skull. That would typically be the process if your brain was somehow able to recover, at least from that, because all the memories you have affected the brain and shaped it, and that would have been lost. With Derek, because this was not the case, the brain itself must have a memory within each of the cell of how it was connected and rebuilt from there. Now, what is the probability, or how probable is this in general, do you ask? Oh wait, nobody's asking that? Good, because the reality is completely and utterly not gonna happen. The only process that possibly would be maintained is the healing of the brain by cellular division of the neurons, which requires the infection itself to behave in a certain way, which we're about to go into that, but the actual keeping of memories, that would be long lost. So really, if you destroy your brain as a vampire, I would argue you basically return back to a baby until you figure everything out once again. Moving on, this is clearly a virus by the way it behaves, but also how it forces your body to respond. But you know what it sort of sounds like? The mythical rabies. Well, to a degree, because of how it spreads by biting, but that's kind of where the similarities end. As the virus moves into the body, it will infect all cells, apparently regardless of functionality. This would indicate that the virus may have multiple attachment abilities to all different types of cells in order to achieve this. Considering it is a human disease and no other animal appears affected, this would not be surprising at all, as it is specialized to infecting human cells regardless of cell type. But the point is, once entering a cell, it would inspire certain events. The first is, regardless of cell type, mitotic abilities would be enhanced. In things like muscle and skin, it would be noticeable due to how the skin heals after being burned by the sun. In other areas, such as neurons, this would be a massive boon for survival, as clearly Derek can survive a hit with apparently his neural tissue taking just moments to heal, such as a direct hit with the French SWAT, as clearly they hit his spine, which knocked him down. But the top-down issue still remains something of a mystery. And by that I mean, how would the virus understand how to connect the neural tissue in just the right way in order to allow for the retention of memories once those neurons were destroyed? And for this, I don't really believe there's an answer apart from, much like the disease itself, it appears supernatural. A virus could inspire mitosis by influencing cellular behavior, but to link up perfectly to the point of repairing the brain in such a way that all prior functions return would be something well beyond what would be stored in the coding of the cell or within the means for the virus to achieve. I'll leave that open to you though. If you have an idea of how potentially this could work, I really do enjoy reading what your guys' kind of thoughts on these things are. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like is greatly appreciated, as YouTube is once again algorithm driven, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Twitch, and Roanoke Games streaming links in the description for all those interested. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our 2 astrophysicists, Death Dancer and Phoenix. I'd also like to thank our scientists as well, Countryside Limbo, and our residents, Amadeus Rivera and Trey Windenall. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping things running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.